Hi, I'm Debbie Smith, the moderator of the 2023 Spring Organic Landscaping Series. I want to welcome you to the third 2023 Organic Landscaping Series. This is a four-part program, which started in March of 2023. The programs are on the third Thursday of each month from March 2023 to June 2023 from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Today, on May 18th, 2023, we have Sarah Evans, who is a PhD, MPH, an assistant professor in environmental medicine and public health from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, New York, to speak to us about what is the science regarding pesticide use and what are the health concerns for pesticide use, especially for children. If you missed the first two of the series on March 16th, 2023 and April 20th, 2023, you can watch them on YouTube, which is through the Watertown Free Public Library's website. The first one was by Jim Agabitis from Minuteman Landscaping, who talked about how do you define organic landscaping? What are the associated costs and what you could do at your home? And on April 20th, the program was by Denise Brockenrecker from the Mass Water Resources Authority, who talked about what you can do in and outside your home to protect our water supply and what are the concerns regarding pesticide use. And as I said, you could watch it on the Watertown Free Public Library's website. And feel free to like what you watch, because the more likes, I think it gets higher up and more people will see it. The last one in this series will be on June 15th, 2023, with Chip Osborne and community project leaders on what was done in Wellesley, Mass. To make it beautiful and learn about organic public lands and current local projects. And as I mentioned last month in the series, my local Congresswoman, Emily Izzo, informed me that she received an email from Gregory St. Louis, who's our superintendent of public works. We wrote that here in Watertown, the Department of Public Works only use organic methods on the public lands. So let me introduce Sarah. Sarah Evans is an assistant professor at the Department of Environmental Medicine at Public Health and a member of the Institute of the Exposonic Research at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Her research is focused on the impacts of early life environmental exposures or nervous system development and child behavior. And she's a trusted voice on health effects of toxic chemicals and what individuals can do to protect their own health, as well as how to advocate for healthier practices in their local communities. And without further ado, I'm going to bring in Sarah Evans. She's got wonderful slides to show us. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold all questions until she's done with the presentation. And we welcome questions. So write them down. Feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. And without further ado, Sarah.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I know that throughout this series, some of you may have heard about steps that you can take to use organic landscaping around your home. And I'm going to talk today about some of the reasons behind why you should do that, and specifically what the impacts of many of the common pesticides that we use on our lawns and our gardens are on children's health. And then I'll talk a little bit about a specific situation that we get a lot of questions about, and what we recommend that you do. And then hopefully we'll have a lot of time for questions at the end. So as Debbie mentioned, I work with a team of physicians and scientists at the Icahn School of Medicine for Mount Sinai. And I'm not only affiliated with the Research Institute there, but I wanted to share with you that we have a team of specially trained clinicians and pediatricians who treat children who have been exposed to environmental chemicals, who help families identify ways to create safer environments. And just to acknowledge that we have funding from the federal government, from the National Institutes of Health, and from the state of New York to do all of this work. So again, we're not only doing research into early life exposures and how they influence health outcomes, but we're also involved in healthcare, treating patients to create healthier environments and better health outcomes, and then education. So you can see here one of my pediatrician colleagues, Dr. Perry Sheffield, talking about metals in baby food on CBS News, and another colleague, Megan Horton, advocating for pesticide legislation. So we really take the research that's happening in the laboratory out into the community. So again, we have clinical practices. We have an environmental pediatrics clinic at Mount Sinai, which is very unique. And I'm going to share a link so that you can access some of these resources at the end of my talk. But the work that we're doing is really motivated by statistics like this. So we know that many of the chronic diseases, both of childhood and of later life stages, have an environmental origin. And so even though we solved the human genome and we can sequence all of the genes in the body, we didn't uncover the causes for all of these diseases. And many of these have doubled or tripled in lifetime risk over the last 10 or 20 years. And so we know that that's much faster than could be explained by evolution, by simple genetic evolution. And so, some of you may have seen the recent statistics that now 1 in 36 children is diagnosed with autism by the age of 8. 1 in 6 kids have developmental disabilities. 1 in 12 go on to develop cardiovascular disease. And so as I'm going to talk about some of the common pesticides that we use and some of the health outcomes that are associated with them, you're going to notice that many of these health outcomes have also been linked to pesticide use. And so we are studying what we call the exposome. And so we work within the Institute for Exposomics Research. And I wanted to introduce this to you because it can be a new concept for many people, but it really explains how we're thinking about the ways that environment, whether it be pesticides, chemicals in plastics, chemicals in our food, air pollutants, but also things like nutrition, stress, social supports, how all of those things interact across our lifespan with who we are. So whether we're male or female, if we have pre-existing conditions, what our weight is, what our genes are, all of those factors really interact to impact our health. And that's a very different way of thinking about, how one pesticide chemical at a time might influence health. We think about the really big picture. And so the reason why we have to do that is because we know that we're not exposed to one thing at a time, one pesticide. And when we think about all the pesticides that we're exposed to, we're talking today largely about lawn and garden pesticides, but we're also exposed to pesticides through other routes, like through our diet. And so when the CDC conducts studies, they look every other year at what we call the body burden, the chemical body burden, in a representative sample of individuals starting from age 3 throughout the United States. They find more than 200 common chemicals present in the blood of nearly all Americans, in the blood and urine of nearly all Americans. Of those, there are more than 40 pesticides. Many of the exposures to pesticides and some of these other chemicals are found to be higher in children and also higher in Black and Hispanic participants. And it's important to consider that these are really sort of chronic, low dose, everyday exposures that we have through products in our environment, not necessarily a high dose acute exposure. And so we have to think about that when we're thinking about, what may seem to be a low level pesticide exposure that we experience, say, every day on our yard. So we're very worried about children's exposures because we know that they're uniquely vulnerable to exposures, not only to pesticides, but to other chemicals. And this is because they have a different physiology than adults do, and they also have different behaviors. So of course, they're closer to the ground, and many pollutants and pesticides settle in dust and soil on the ground. They breathe faster and a higher air volume than adults do. And so that means that they're going to breathe in more chemicals that are in the air than an adult would. And then, of course, they normally put things in their mouths. And they tend to eat sort of a less varied diet. And that might include, for example, a lot of fruits and vegetables that might be contaminated with pesticides. And they eat and drink more pound for pound than an adult does. So they're just getting a lot more dietary exposures, inhalational exposures, and exposures through other sources in the environment. And then their bodies are still developing. So they may not be able to as easily detoxify the chemicals that come into their bodies. Oops. And so we consider when we look at environmental chemicals like pesticides, we really have to consider when an individual is being exposed. And we've identified windows of susceptibility, we call them, and those are time periods when the body is developing and most sensitive to certain types of environmental toxins. And here, on this timeline, I've put pregnancy, infancy, early childhood, and into adolescence. But there are sensitive periods that extend beyond childhood and adolescence, including menopause, other times when the body is going through changes. But it is important to note that we think a lot about little children and pregnant women, but the brain and the reproductive system are two systems that are developing, well into your 20s, and so we have to really think about the exposures that are occurring beyond early childhood. And so this is just an example of what's been shown for the pesticide DDT, an insecticide that has been banned. I'll mention this a couple times throughout the talk. This is something that's no longer in use, but highly persistent. And so it stayed in our environment. And this is just to show this example of how windows of susceptibility work. And so exposure to DDT has been associated with breast cancer, but your risk and when you develop breast cancer depends on when you were exposed to DDT. So for individuals who were exposed very early in life, before they went through puberty, before the age of 13, they had a much higher risk. So the OR refers to the odds ratio, or the risk of going on to develop breast cancer. They had a much higher risk of developing breast cancer before age 50, so an early onset breast cancer, if they were exposed to DDT early in life. And then for girls who were exposed to DDT later, mostly during or after the pubertal period, starting at age 14, they had a higher risk of developing breast cancer at older ages. So just showing the importance of when you get exposed to your risk of going on to develop disease, and this idea that there really are these sensitive periods that we have to consider. So it's not only you getting exposed to a pesticide chemical like DDT that puts your own health at risk, it's your mother or your grandmother. And so in environmental health, we consider transgenerational exposures. And so in the case of DDT, what studies found was that if your grandmother was exposed to DDT, then you, as the granddaughter, had the higher risk of going on to develop breast cancer. So we have to think sort of about this legacy of environmental exposures. And even though we don't have DDT in use here in this country anymore, we can still suffer the health effects of prior use through this kind of transgenerational effect. So we have children being more susceptible, pregnant women, the developing fetus, all being more susceptible to pesticide exposures. But we know from very large studies, like the study, the Agricultural Health Study, which takes place here in the United States, that pesticide applicators are at a much higher risk from pesticide exposures than the general public. That makes a lot of sense. They're certainly exposed to these chemicals at much higher levels, and they often don't have the right kind of protective equipment to limit exposures. This was a very high profile case. This is Dwayne Lee Johnson, who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma that was attributed to exposure to the herbicide glyphosate, which you're probably all familiar with as the active ingredient in Roundup. He did get a settlement with Monsanto, the manufacturer of that product, for $78 million. And there have been a number of other lawsuits that have come out of the use of glyphosate and the development of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So a lot of what we know about the health impacts of pesticides, we know from studies of agricultural workers and pesticide applicators. So we think about who's exposed and when they're exposed. And I sort of gave a brief introduction to how we think about exposomics and how everything in our environment interacts to determine whether we stay healthy or whether we get sick. And this is just another example of how pesticides can work in sort of complex ways in our body. So a lot of pesticides, I'll talk more about specific pesticides as I go through the talk. But this is an example of a specific pesticide that, like many, is toxic to the central nervous system. And what studies have shown is that depending on your level of a certain enzyme in your liver, you may be more at risk of the neurotoxic effects of these types of pesticides to go on to develop learning and behavioral problems or things like neurodegenerative disease. So your individual susceptibility can depend on, things like your genetic makeup and your metabolic makeup. So these are other factors that can put you at risk of pesticide exposure that you may not know. Most of us don't know which enzyme we carry in our liver. And so how did we sort of get here? And I think it's interesting to look back at where pesticide use came from in this country and why we have sort of this culture of needing to have very perfect, very manicured and landscaped front lawns. This is an image from Long Island from a housing development of 6,000 homes called Watertown. And this was sort of a post-World War II housing development that popped up all around the country, where homeowners were really required to maintain a perfect lawn. And so out of this kind of need to have a perfect lawn, show off your perfect lawn, grew an entire industry around lawn mowers, gas-powered garden equipment, which is something that I talk a lot about as well in terms of the health impacts of using that equipment, and then a whole industry around pesticides and grass seed and fertilizer and other things that people believed were required to keep this perfect lawn. And these are just some examples of some advertisements from the 1940s. This is actually 2,4-D. And I'll show you some more recent data about how prevalent this 2,4-D, which is an herbicide that is a component of Agent Orange and thought to have a number of health effects, including neurotoxicity, still in use today. This is a DDT containing wallpaper in a child's room. And I mentioned already that DDT was shown to be highly toxic, particularly to the developing nervous system and reproductive system. And so here we were even selling it in wallpaper. And so here we are now when we walk into our local garden store and we see that there are a whole slew of chemicals that are available for us to, perpetuate this idea of having a perfect lawn. And understandably, most of us think that if it is there on the shelf, it must be safe. And to be sold in this country, all of these chemicals, all of these pesticide products actually have to be registered with the EPA. So there's a sense that they must be safe if we can buy them and the EPA has said it's okay. We know that really is not the case. Our research shows that that's not the case. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of pesticide bans and restrictions where products go to the marketplace and are in use often for decades with approval from the US EPA and then later withdrawn because of the health effects. And so these are just some of the top US pesticide industry sales. So some of the most common ingredients that you'll see, particularly in the top portion of this table, showing home and garden products. So again, 2,4-D is still one of the most highly applied home and garden herbicides, as well as glyphosate, mecoprop. You can see these are mostly herbicides, and then also carbaryl. And here you can see all of the, or probably not all of them, but some of the main health impacts that have been identified that go along with all of these, highly used home and garden as well as agricultural pesticide chemicals. And these are used on the order of over 1 billion pounds per year across 88 million homes. And this is a $14 billion industry. And so, as I mentioned, these products are regulated to some degree by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so why do we have this disconnect that numerous studies show health impacts for these products, and yet they're still approved and for use and easily available in the marketplace? And so there are a lot of flaws. One is that I mentioned again the exposome and how we think about how multiple exposures interact with one another. But when the EPA studies pesticide chemicals, they study just the active ingredient, which can be a very small percentage of the entire product. So they're not assessing how this whole product affects your health. These products are often under registration review for many, many years. So as new data is published, it's not considered right away. There are years long processes in order to determine whether or not we can continue to use a product. And in the meantime, it stays on the shelf. And you may see on some of the pesticide products that you can purchase in the store that they have a label that will either say caution, warning, danger, or danger poisoning. And these really consider only acute or high level exposures if it were to get in your eye or if you were to accidentally ingest it. So it doesn't consider what we commonly experience, which is, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of low level, chronic, daily exposure to these products. Something that's really important to consider that comes up often when people ask us questions about product use and exposure is that you see the little yellow sign on your neighbor's lawn. Hopefully you don't, but you probably do, indicating that a pesticide has been applied and you should just stay off of it for 24 or 48 or maybe at most 72 hours. But these pesticide chemicals actually have long half-lives. So the time that it takes for half of the product to degrade for glyphosate actually can be up to a year. So glyphosate can stay around in the soil for up to a year. When you track these chemicals into your home, or if they come into your home on the bottom of your shoes or your pet's feet, they persist even longer, because how long they stay in the environment is really dependent on weather conditions, degradation by UV light and things like that, temperature. And so it's been found that when they come into your home, they can stay around even longer and often accumulate in dust. So what are some of those health risks? I've mentioned a few of them already. Pesticides have really been shown to interfere with many different systems in the body. I think most people think of toxicity to the nervous system or different types of cancers. But we know, particularly from some of those agricultural health studies, that exposures are associated with increased risk of things like heart disease and stroke. Children who live closer to agricultural fields have a greater risk of respiratory problems like asthma. And then they can also interfere with reproductive development, contribute to diabetes and obesity risk. So a number of health risks have been identified with chronic pesticide exposure. And so I just wanted to kind of zero in on a little bit about the mechanism around how we know that those associations, those linkages are real. And so when we think about insecticides, specifically the class of pesticides that are designed to kill insects, do that by interfering with the nervous system of the pesticide. And we know that these various classes of pesticides that I've linked here, which are very common in the marketplace, you have likely heard of most of these, that they are designed to specifically interfere with how two nerve cells communicate with one another. And so neonicotinoids, organophosphate pesticides, pyrethroids, organochlorines, all interfere in some way with the way that nerves talk to each other. And when they can't talk to each other, you can't function. And that can also lead to nerve cell death and degeneration, for example. So we know that there's a true mechanism. They're actually designed to work this way. And these are just some examples of a few of the studies on different types of pesticide chemicals that have shown associations with one very powerful study on chlorpyrifos, which is an organophosphate pesticide, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Fortunately, is being phased out of use in this country, but was actually associated with changes in brain structure. So it's very rare that studies are able to look at the brain on MRI and show an association between how the brain looks and exposure to a chemical. And that's exactly what this study was able to do, was show that there were actually changes in brain structure when women were exposed to this pesticide during pregnancy. We also see things like decreases in IQ, more behavioral problems in children. I mentioned on the previous slide that learning disabilities or learning disorders and developmental disabilities are seen in 1 in 6 children now. Pesticides are linked to many of those adverse outcomes, particularly when exposure happens during pregnancy. 2,4-D, again, associated with auditory processing defects, and neurotoxicity, cell death in the brains of adult rats. And the other outcome that we think of a lot when we think about pesticide toxicity is increased risk of cancer. And so I did mention that a lot of these studies have been done in farming communities. And so this is where we get a lot of our information about health outcomes. Farming communities have higher rates of leukemia, lymphoma, sarcoma, brain, and other cancers. But we also see this for children who live close to agricultural areas, that they have increased risk of child leukemia. And then we see just in non-agricultural, non-occupational settings that sort of your normal daily residential exposure to some of these chemicals have been linked to increased risks of childhood cancers. This again is the story of glyphosate and non-Hodgkin lymphoma that Dwayne Lee Johnson experienced. And these are just some of the studies, again, largely in agricultural workers and pesticide applicators, but these are different studies, different cohorts that all showed an increased risk in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma following chronic exposure to glyphosate or chronic use of glyphosate in the workplace. And there is ongoing debate around whether glyphosate is truly carcinogenic. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, which is the Cancer Research Division of the World Health Organization, has classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. The US EPA did not agree with that classification. But this is just to show that we do have multiple rigorous epidemiological studies showing associations between glyphosate use and non-Hodgkin lymphoma risks specifically. But glyphosate, again, the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup, very highly used in the home and garden sector, also associated with other non-cancer health risks that we don't think about as much. But these are things like altered reproductive development, disruption of the microbiome, so the healthy bacteria that live in the gut, which can contribute to a lot of different health outcomes, including things like immune dysfunction and cardiovascular disease. And in animal studies, it's been shown to be associated with autistic-like behaviors. So those are some of the common health outcomes that we think about, that we have data to show the health impacts of the use of common active ingredients in pesticides. But I mentioned that often the active ingredient is just a small part of the entire mixture of the pesticide products. So often pesticides have synergistic additives that help it stick around longer, stick to whatever it's applied to, not get degraded as quickly in sunlight. And so there have been several studies now that have shown the presence of some of these synergists, like this chemical, which is called PBO for short, piperonyl butoxide, that ingredient actually was associated with increased risk of asthma and increased risk of neurodevelopmental problems when women were exposed during pregnancy. So it may not be that active ingredient, which in the case of this product was permethrin, which was present at 30%. And then we had PBO present also at 30%, and other ingredients, which are trade secrets, present at 40%. And then here's another example of a glyphosate containing product with almost 64% of the product made up of other ingredients, and you're not told what those are. So we can't really determine the safety of these products because the manufacturer does not have to disclose them. And so I just want to touch on a sort of indirect impact of the use of pesticides. And that is the impact of pesticide use on climate change and the impact of climate change use on pesticides. So with the changing climate, I'm going to talk about a specific example for this that I think you're probably all pretty familiar with. But with the changing climate, we're having warmer temperatures that promote the growth of insects and spread of insect-borne diseases, which are leading to greater pesticide use. We're also having, wetter weather, which may change the balance of weed growth, leading to the need for more herbicides. And what's happening with the application of the increased amount of pesticide is not only that it's directly potentially impacting our health through direct exposures, but it's also disrupting the soil and changing the health of the soil. And the soil is a really important carbon sink that can that can help to mitigate climate change. And so we're sort of caught in a cycle. Pesticides are also largely petroleum-based chemicals. So we need to extract petroleum in order to make them. And their manufacture and use requires a lot of water. And so this is just to show sort of, I think people are increasingly appreciating the myriad of health impacts that climate change is causing beyond just extreme heat. I mentioned vector-borne diseases. We've really been suffering, at least at my house, from really high levels and very sort of virulent pollen this year. And so we're really bearing all of the health impacts of that. And that's, not only impacted by pesticide use, but sort of feeding into increased use of pesticides. So when we think about the whole health burden of pesticide use, we also have to consider climate change. And so I just wanted to touch on one at the end of my talk. I'm going to share a link to a lot of the resources that we have that provide, practical steps that you can take to reduce exposure to pesticides. This is one example, and it's very timely because we're very much in tick and Lyme disease season right now, which again starts earlier and earlier and is a little bit less predictable each year. And so you're probably, I grew up in Connecticut, so very familiar with all of this. But within the life cycle of ticks, tick larvae are very, very small. The tick larvae and the tick nymphs are very, very small. And so they're out in the spring, and that's when you're most likely to get a disease carrying tick bite because they're so difficult to catch. And so you can see here the highest number of cases of Lyme disease tend to be reported in the late spring and early summer. And young children are amongst the highest victims of contracting Lyme disease in the country. And so this is a true public health problem. And we have to balance the risks and benefits. And so, a lot of families will contact us and ask, what can I do to protect my family from tick bites, protect my family from the diseases that ticks carry, because it kind of feels like you need to blanket your lawn in pesticide chemicals to avoid this. And so we do counsel families on safer prevention of tick bites. So recognizing that that this is a serious public health problem. We give non-chemical, as a first line of defense. There are non-chemical things that you can do both for yourself when you're out, in the woods or in the grass. This is an example of a really probably very tick-laden area. As you would walk through the grass, they tend to sit on grass and plants and wait for you to brush up against them. So if you brush up against them, the likelihood of a tick getting onto you is higher. They don't jump or fly. So you do kind of have to come into contact. So walking down the center of the trail, wearing long pants, wearing light colors so that you can see ticks, and then immediately checking all the places where a tick might get, and even putting your clothes in the dryer on high heat. And then out in the yard, rather than as a first line of defense, putting down a massive pesticide application, a widespread pesticide application, which is harmful to you, harmful to your pets, certainly harmful to beneficial insects, which is a big concern, and harmful to other wildlife. Keeping the grass short, keeping piles of wood and debris out, using fences to keep host animals out. So many of you probably know that, the small rodents are the ones that really are carrying the infected ticks into your yard. So as much as you can keep those out, the safer you can be. You can install gravel or mulch around your property, and then keep the areas where your children play away from the property edge. But sometimes a form of pesticide chemical is needed, and that's when you can try to employ safer use of pesticide chemicals. And so sometimes people are surprised that we will recommend use, sort of the judicious use of insect repellents. So rather than, doing a mass lawn application, if you know that you or your child are going to be in a situation, we get questions about summer camp a lot, where kids are often required to utilize and self-apply insect repellents. So many people are surprised to find that that one of the most studied insect repellents with one of the safest profiles is actually DEET. If you use it at a maximum of 30% concentration, you can buy 100% DEET. That is very much not recommended or any more effective. Oil of lemon eucalyptus is also highly effective, although it hasn't been approved for use on children under the ages of 3 years, and then picaridin. But of these three, DEET actually has undergone the most extensive study in pregnant women and in children. And then another important point to make is to avoid aerosols that lead to inhalational exposures, and never use a combination sunscreen and bug repellent, because you have to apply, they can cancel out each other's effect. And also because you should be applying sunscreen much more frequently than you would want to be applying insect repellent. So that would just be overdoing it. And so one of the most effective and most recommended things that you can use in your yard to minimize pesticide exposures, but maximize protection against ticks when you really need to, are tick bait boxes. And so those have bait that draw the rodents that carry the ticks in, and then they coat the rodent with a pesticide that will repel ticks, and they're very secure, so that other insects and animals and children are not exposed. And then I don't really need to get into this. We have information about this on our website as well. And you can find a lot of really good information on how to remove a tick and when to see a doctor. So that's kind of one example of a balanced approach to avoiding pesticide exposures that I can give you. And so that's kind of a behavioral changes that you can do at home. But that really, only directly helps you and your own family. And so other strategies that we really advocate for are market pressure. So supporting landscapers, for example, who are going organic, They need to see that there is a market for it, and that has been increasing, which is great. We're buying organic in the grocery store or at your local farmer's market. And then the highest impact that we can have on decreasing exposure, not only for us, for ourselves, but for our communities at large, is to pursue stronger regulations and advocate for stronger regulations. So I'm going to give a couple examples of each of those different levels. Rather than overwhelm people, we try to give simple steps that you can take to reduce your exposure to pesticides. And one of the very effective and evidence-based strategies that you can use to reduce pesticide exposure is to take your shoes off at the door, which seems really simple. You can also use mats to wipe them, and mats for, like your pet's feet. But the EPA actually has done studies which show reduced levels of pesticides inside the home and in the dust in the home when people remove their shoes or use sticky mats that they can wipe the bottoms of their shoes on. We also know that eating organic or foods that are not treated with synthetic pesticides can very quickly reduce the levels of pesticides that are in your body, and it really only takes a few days. And washing hands, again, super simple, seems very obvious, but we have evidence to show that washing your hands and wet mopping or wet dusting can be really effective at reducing your exposure not only to pesticides, but to many other household chemicals that get on your hands and also settle in the dust in your home. Another, moving sort of beyond those individual things that you can do, this is my lawn. I wish there wasn't even this much grass here, but you can see that we have a lot of clover. And I live in sort of an area that's kind of like the Watertown picture. So all of our lawns are very small and very much contiguous with one another. And so if my lawn looks bad, it looks, totally out of place. But we don't use any synthetic chemicals. And I think it looks very healthy and green and lush. And so, my neighbors know that we don't do that. And friends and neighbors ask questions, well, how are you doing that? And how are you maintaining that such a green lawn without using any chemicals? So showing it off and letting people know, and just sort of normalizing that this doesn't have to be, uniform blades of grass across the entire lawn. And I wanted to share an example of how we've taken the research to advocate with a number of community organizations and legislators to effectively ban all synthetic pesticides in the New York City parks. So this was a very exciting development. I'm here with Jay Feldman, who is the director of the advocacy organization Beyond Pesticides, Ben Kalos, who was a former New York City Council member, and Paula Rogovin, who was a kindergarten teacher in New York City. And we are in a school talking to families about why we should pass a ban on pesticides in all New York City parks and places where children play. And this ban actually passed last year on Earth Day. And we've been working together with a coalition, including Beyond Pesticides and Stonyfield Farms, and actually Chip Osborne, who's going to speak to this group, who is really the preeminent expert in how to maintain really beautiful organic parks. And we've been working collectively to train the New York City Parks Department to make sure that they can do this and do this properly. And there are several demonstration parks across the city. And so if New York City can do this, like I assure you, Watertown can do it. Many local parks departments are learning how to do this. Landscapers can do this on your own lawn. So this was a really exciting success story. Some more success stories. I mentioned chlorpyrifos as being an organophosphate pesticide that is toxic to the developing nervous system. It was banned for use for many years. for residential use for many years, but was still permitted for use in agriculture and on food crops. So we're continuing to have ongoing exposure, and state by state, some bans and restrictions began to pass, and finally, it's being banned for use on food crops. But this is another example of something that was in use for decades, that we were exposed to for decades, that was highly toxic to the nervous system. And despite evidence to show that, it took many years to get it out of the marketplace. But nevertheless, this is a great success story. Neonicotinoid pesticides, again, a lot of this happens at the state level first, and largely due to constituents who are going to their legislators and saying we should be doing this, constituents and advocacy groups. And so New York State just began to restrict the use of neonicotinoids, which, as I had mentioned previously, have been shown to be toxic to the nervous system, and of course are highly toxic to bees and pollinators. And then here in Massachusetts, there may be people on this call who have more information about this, but here in Massachusetts, some restrictions have also already been placed on neonicotinoids for residential use. But this work is ongoing. And so these are just a couple of examples of bills that Debbie had actually shared with me, that there are a number of bills that were raised this year in the state of Massachusetts. Two examples, one that would restrict the use of pesticides around children, and another that would eliminate neonicotinoids to protect pollinators. So these, I think, are, these are really things to keep an eye on. I encourage you all to contact your legislators and ask them to support these. And so just moving towards wrapping up, I like to end on good news. State and municipal pesticide bans are increasing. U.S. organic food sales and the sale of other organic products are going up every year. So they're now over $60 billion. So this can be profitable. I mentioned that the pesticide industry is very profitable, but we can turn the tides and use our dollars to support the organic marketplace. And I think we've all seen, even in the last few years, that organic products have become much more widely available. A lot of the pesticide chemicals, so going all the way back to DDT, I told you that is still in our environment decades later. Because it's highly persistent, it does not break down. It also builds up in our bodies, unfortunately. And so the newer pesticides, while we still have concerns about health impacts, they don't last as long in the environment, and they don't build up the same way inside of our bodies. So I mentioned before that studies have shown that if you swap out a conventional diet for an organic diet, within just a few days, you can dramatically reduce your exposure to a lot of different pesticide chemicals. And we're looking at resiliency and how positive exposures can actually mitigate a lot of these risks. And so we know, again, going back to thinking about the exposome, a nurturing environment, a healthy environment with a lot of social supports, can help to counteract some of the risks that we see from pesticide exposures. And that's something that we're, sort of just beginning to graze the surface of understanding. So lastly, I just wanted to share a QR code. You can take a picture of it, or I can put the link in the chat afterwards. We have a lot of educational materials, fact sheets, infographics, web pages where you can get more information, get more practical tips, but you can also, incorporate this information maybe into a letter that you want to write to your legislators. And you can say, this is what the research shows. This is what Mount Sinai is showing. So all of those materials are really free to the public for those purposes. And we have, we're also on social media at Sinai Exposomics, or our New York State network of environmental health centers at Nice Check, and our pediatric environmental health specialty unit, the Region 2 Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit. And I should tell you, that is a national network of regional centers. And you also in Massachusetts. So I'm in Region 2, which is New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And but you all are in Region 1. So you're served by a different PACU, but those pediatric environmental health specialty units are great resources to go to speak with clinicians that have expertise in these areas. So you can, so that's it for me. Thank you so much for attending, and I will take any questions. I'll close this out, and I will put that link in the chat for you all.
Okay, we're opening up for questions, and if you could please put your questions either in the Q&A or in the chat, and we can ask. I will be asking Sarah the questions. I'll give you a few minutes for that. In the meantime, Sarah, when I wonder if you could comment on something like dicamba, that it was, I believe, banned by a federal judge, and then it was brought back by the EPA. Do you know much about it?
Yeah, so dicamba is widely used in agriculture in this country, and it's sort of a classic case of many things that we see happening just in the chemical industry overall. So, because we have sort of a pesticide treadmill with overuse of things like glyphosate, sometimes I show like super weeds, maybe other speakers have spoken to this issue, where weeds become resistant to different types of chemicals, and then you need to bring in another chemical. You need to substitute with another chemical. And so, I think also the situation with dicamba is, again, sort of the push-pull between EPA and the pesticide industry lobbying, saying we need this. We can't be profitable without it. And so that's the challenge that we see, where it takes decades to really get something out of the marketplace.
Are there health concerns with dicamba? Do you know?
There are. So I think that it's been linked to basically all of the things that we think about, neurotoxicity, I think immune disruption, and things like that. And it's largely used in agriculture. And so the workers, I think there's more research that's needed to be done. It hasn't been in use for as long as some of the others, but looking at the health outcomes in the workers, I think, is really important.
Let's see. Donna Holt question is, how organic is our said good? I understand that most of our soil water sources are loaded with chemicals. It's probably soil, I believe. That's probably a
How
type.
organic is our?
It sounds like how organic is our soil, because water sources are loaded.
Oh, yeah. So, and I'm not sure the level of testing that you can have done in Massachusetts. You can, I know in Connecticut and New York, you can take a soil sample and you can send it out, and they will test it for certain things and certain toxins. But yeah, for example, it's a little bit off topic, but also related to this, perfluoroalkylated substances, per and polyfluoroalkylated substances, or PFAS chemicals. The Teflon chemicals are highly persistent in the environment, and you may have heard, that they're widespread water contaminants. They're found in rain. That's one example of a chemical that's found in rain. So certainly, they're also found in a lot of waterways. So certainly, those chemicals are likely to turn up in our soil. I think people who are, truly organic gardening, and maybe there are some of those individuals on this call now, will amend the soil with organic soil or compost that's been tested for a whole host of chemicals. But because of how pervasive so many chemicals are in our environment, unfortunately, we all have some level of those chemicals in our soil.
The University of Massachusetts, I believe in Amherst, does do soil testing, and you can send, you could just get onto their website, I believe, and you can send your soil samples to them. I don't remember what the cost is, but I don't think it's too expensive, and they'll send you what's in your soil and what's recommended, which is great.
Yeah, in Connecticut, Icahn does the same thing, and I think it's like $11 a sample.
Okay, next question. Vivian Orlowski says, great presentation. Our Board of Health is planning on restricting use of glyphosate products on all town-owned or managed lands. What other herbicides should we ask the Board of Health to include in their restrictions?
Oh, what other pesticides? Was that the question?
What other herbicides should we ask the Board of Health to include in their restrictions?
And that's for use on public.
I'm not sure. It's that's the town, and I'm not sure if it's in Watertown or what town, because I know
Oh,
that
yeah,
we're
town owned or managed lands. Yeah.
not putting anything on the grass anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I would say no synthetic herbicides, and I would have it be a hard line at that. And New York City has done it. Philadelphia passed legislation around that. So I think there's no reason I would go for absolutely no synthetic herbicides, because there really isn't a safe one that can be recommended. The one thing that a lot of towns will push back on, well, two things. One is golf courses. So I'm not aware, I mean, I'm only aware of maybe one golf course in the country that is organic. But usually what happens is there are exemptions for golf courses, even if other town properties can be maintained organic. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Golf courses. Oh, and invasives. So often municipalities and conservation commissions will argue that they need to be able to use something to combat invasives.
Are you just talking about herbicides, or is just some pesticides in general? Pesticides, fungicides? You talking about all of that, or just herbicides?
Well, it applies to all, but I was thinking of herbicides, particularly when we're talking about something that's really cosmetic. But the invasives, someone else, yes, she said, the Conservation Commission allows herbicides. Yeah, and that's the case in a lot of communities. But I think if you can get, organic on the invasives, are probably not an issue on the areas where children play, fields, parks, playgrounds, right?
Okay, Maria Rose's question is, any recommendation to reduce grubs that are safer than dimetha something chemical?
Yes, I'm not an expert though. You should probably ask Chip Osborne when he comes. But I do know, because I have done it, but I'm not an expert enough to tell you, but there are a couple of different treatments that you can do. I think one of them is bacterial. You should ask Chip Osborne.
Come to the next.
But I've heard from a number of organic landscapers that they can do it. I think it's hard, but they can do it.
Let's see. Maria Rosel said milky spore is one option.
Milky spore, thank you.
Have you used that, or do you know much about it?
I have used it. I've looked into it. I have small children that play on my yard and been happy with the safety profile of it. Yeah. Have we, fully eliminated grubs? No, but that's not the milky spore's fault. That's probably my own, I did not hire a professional to do it. But I've heard from professionals that they can do it. So I would persist.
Other questions, folks? Why don't you put them in the chat or the question Q&A? Why don't you tell whether they're doing that? Tell about your background. How did you end up doing this type of work?
Sure. So I actually went to graduate school for neuroscience, for cell molecular neuroscience. And so I was studying, cells in the brain that, help, or different proteins in the brain that help the brain develop, right? And but when I was finishing my doctoral degree, I thought, this is sort of far removed from human beings and public health and population health. So I joined a fellowship program at Mount Sinai, which was very unique, that allowed me to get a master's in public health, get training in epidemiology, and sort of learn about how the environment impacts health, which is not something that you classically get when you're studying how the brain develops, actually. They're very much connected. And so that was, sort of how I came to where I was. But I always had, I went to a small liberal arts college in Maine. I always had an interest in being outdoors and an interest in the environment. And so it kind of, this, working in this field allowed me to bring those things together, human health, population health, and the environment. So the things that we do to benefit the environment also benefit our health, and vice versa. So I think that's great.
Okay, Chris Anderson says many crops are treated with herbicides as descants before harves, e.g., like potatoes and wheat. But then products like chips are labeled non-GMO as though that means they're safe. Do you think that those labels are intentionally misleading?
I think labeling is always very misleading. We talk a lot about, greenwashing, and, slapping a label on something to make you think that it's actually better or it's actually safe. So I think, yeah, GMO labeling can be misused, can be misinterpreted, and also is not, always entirely meaningful. What I will say about GMOs, and I sometimes show some graphs and maps of the United States that show how much the use of glyphosate has increased over time, in parallel with the massive rise in GMO soy, especially GMO soy, and GMO corn and other GMO crops. So, these products are engineered, the GMO soy and corn and other crops are engineered to not die when you douse them with glyphosate or other herbicides. And so they've been shown, those conventional crops have been shown to have higher levels of pesticide residues, meaning, that when you consume them, you may also be more highly exposed. GMO, there's nothing to say that the GMO, something about making a GMO product is inherently toxic or bad. We don't have evidence to support that, but we do have evidence to support that it's likely that those products have higher pesticide residues. And so that's why we, that's the evidence that we have. And so that's why we recommend avoiding GMOs. But as this person did say, those chemicals can also be used in the drying process as a desiccant. And so and they can also be used on any conventional crop. So yes, just the fact that you see on the label non-GMO doesn't mean organic. So it's not equivalent with organic. It doesn't tell you really anything about the pesticide residue level. So it's something to consider. It's one thing that may suggest that the product has lower pesticide residues, but it's not a guarantee. And yes, I do, in terms of being intentionally misleading, I certainly do think that a lot of labeling is done and greenwashing is done to sell the product. So.
Can you talk more about the GMOs? Are they safe if something's genetically modified, is it safe to eat those products?
As I said before, there is no scientific evidence, solid scientific evidence to support any negative health outcomes associated with just consuming a product that has been genetically modified. Mechanistically, when you ingest it, you digest and break up any, protein that was produced, that was modified. And so there just aren't studies that have shown any harm from, the product being genetically modified in and of itself. There may be, secondary issues, like I mentioned, in terms of having higher pesticide residues or something like that. But just being GMO in general is not, we don't have evidence for negative health outcomes associated with that.
Have there been any studies on that yet, or there's just something that it hasn't been studied extensively?
Yeah, there have not been extensive studies that I am aware of, and studies that have been done have shown them to be safe.
Are there any new studies that are being worked on now that you can give us some future thing looking at what we can
On GMOs or on other
just in
in
general
general?
environmental issues? Yeah.
A lot of let's see, some of the newer data that we have around pesticides goes back to what I was talking about looking at, not just that single active ingredient, which is the way that toxicity testing is usually done, but looking at the whole product. And so one of my colleagues at Mount Sinai has done this, looking at exposure to Roundup, for example, the full pesticide product, compared to just exposure to that active ingredient. And I mentioned that we think that there are, synergistic effects, so that whole product is more harmful than exposure to just the active ingredient. So looking at things, in a more realistic, this is the way that we're actually exposed to these things. And, we also know, there's a saying that a lot of people like to throw around, the dose makes the poison. But that's not necessarily true, particularly with chemicals that interfere with the reproductive system or the hormonal system, for example. Hormones can act at like very, very low levels. And so you see these, bell-shaped curves or inverted U shapes where a lower concentration of a chemical like a pesticide actually can be more harmful than the high concentration. And so looking at, just argues for looking at the realistic exposures that we experience, which are, fairly low level, oftentimes daily, over a long period of time. So those are the kinds of studies that I think are very interesting and very informative. But I would also argue that we have a lot of research to show that many of these chemicals are harmful. And so I think where a lot of energy needs to go is towards designing feasible solutions, ways to intervene, to clean up, because so we have contamination in the environment now. And so we're going to need to clean that up. So getting rid of the chemicals that are already out there, and also demonstrating, like I think Chip Osborne will talk about when he comes, and maybe your other speakers have also, that we have ways to do all of these things, to grow our food, to maintain our gardens without using all these chemicals, and like getting off of the reliance on the chemicals.
Are low doses over a period of time, are they toxic to children and adults?
Yeah, and actually, you raise another good point, which is that so I'm just still trying to get the link for the chat. But another area of active research, and we actually just did a webinar series on it. And if you go to our main page, you can probably find a recording from it. But we just did a really great webinar on environmental health and menopause. So there are definitely populations and time periods of life that are very understudied. So we've studied pregnancy a lot. We've studied early childhood a lot in terms of environmental exposures. But looking at how exposures to everyday low-level chemicals, for example, for women who are going through menopause, or for elderly people, how is their health impacted by those exposures? We know a lot less about that. And so that's a direction that we're going in now.
I don't know if there are any other questions for you. You did such a great job. Thank you. Oh, let's see. Nope, just a thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
No, it's just such an honor to have you speak to us because I mean, especially being out of state and doing such wonderful work in New York at Mount Sinai. And so it's just it's great to learn about the science, what's really going on, what's the data show, and so we can learn from it.
Mhm. Yeah, and take that forward to your decision makers and town council, state representatives. I think it's really important for them to hear from all of you, and show them the science, which is fairly indisputable, and also letting them know that you don't want your children to play or your pets to play on these properties. And it was actually very effective in New York City. The children, I don't know if you saw the headline in the slide that I showed before, but it was really the kindergartners and the children who went to their city council member. They learned about pesticides. They didn't like it. They said, hey, why do we have this? We don't want to have this. And it took several years. The kids got older. They kept with it. They kept with the fight. And then eventually it did pass. And so, the voices of youth, I think, are really important in these discussions too.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me.